Welcome to Growing Up with AI, where I speak to parents, or in this episode, grandparents, who work in AI around how they think about the technology in the context of their kids. Today, I'm thrilled to be joined by Steve Unger, a seasoned expert with a rich history in technology and regulation, including as an executive of the UK's regulator Ofcom. Now advising both the private and public sector, Steve shares his insights on the pace of AI development, effective industry regulation, and the art of guiding the next generation. Steve, welcome to Growing Up with AI.
It's nice to be speaking to you, Gabriel.
So you've been in the tech industry for a long time. When your grandkids ask you, what do? What do you tell them?
It's difficult. They're 5 years old and 1 year old. So I tend to try and describe what you can do with technology. I think you just have to describe technology in terms that are familiar to the people you're talking to. How you produce neat graphics, neat games, autonomous vehicles. There are things that I think people can understand relatively easily because they relate to their experience in real life. What you obviously can't do at this stage is try and explain the intricacies of how the tech works.
Yeah. And you've been in technology for a long time. You were at the heart of the telecom sector. You worked many years in regulation for Ofcom. Now you're advising AI companies such as Faculty AI. What is different around AI compared to other technological hypes that you've seen in the past?
I'm not sure it's that different if you take a long enough historical perspective. It certainly feels a very disruptive right now in terms of all of our lived experience. It's as disruptive as anything that's happened in my lifetime. But if you go back over the course of history, as you know, I've just written a book about the history of telecoms. There's a fascinating period towards the second half of the 19th century where telegraph networks essentially turned human society from something that was local to global. So they made news wires possible so that newspapers could bring news from all around the world. We had the first global network of subsea cables, and they even changed the way we measure time. So that instead of measuring time locally using basically sundials, we were now able to distribute Greenwich Mean Time around the world as a universal measure of time. Back then, technology transformed our society, and it's done that several times. AI has the potential to do the same again, but I don't think that's completely new.
So what is the timeline that you feel this is most comparable to, or the innovation that you feel this is most comparable to?
I would say it feels like a several decade. The interesting thing about most technologies is that they are nascent a long time before they become real. So you can see the origins of the electric telegraph, a century or so before it actually became a popular phenomenon. And I think it's the same with AI. We all know that when I was a student, we were talking about using neural networks to recognize patterns. So it's not as if AI is completely new. It's taken a few decades to get to the point where it's become visible generally. Obviously, large language models had a lot to do with that. And you suspect, what I've seen generally with actually the internet is the classic example, a lot of hype about the dot-com boom 20 or 30 years ago. It's taken a few decades to get to the point where the internet really is something that everyone uses all the time. So I think the interesting thing I find is that the way in which human cultures adopt is rather different from the way in which technologists think about innovation. It's decades rather than months.
So you say that AI isn't really moving much faster than the previous technologies. It's just that we've kind of forgotten a lot of the history of it.
That's probably overstating it a bit, but yeah, that is what I'm saying, perhaps be a bit provocative. There's a lot that I think you can trace back, some of the basic ideas around AI. Clearly, the way in which it burst onto the scene a couple of years ago with ChatGPT and so on, that was disruptive. But part of that feels like it was a particularly accessible application that anybody could understand. It was no longer about fly-by-wire airplane control, which a rather narrow group of technologists could understand. It was now about something that everyone could understand. And I think there was that sudden appreciation of the role AI could play for everyone that was what was important. That's the thing that's been disruptive, I think, over the last couple of years.
Very interested in your views as a previous regulator around how we should now deal with this technology. One of the previous guests on the podcast said when we invented the cars, we taught people how to teach and created some regulation to make it more safely, but we didn't ban it outright. Now, obviously, the governments also are quite nervous, given that I think in many countries they feel they miss social media and the negative impact it has had on many children. What's the right balance here to take to make sure we can take advantage of it, but also we don't end up having these long-term negative side effects?
So I think there are some well-established principles of what constitutes good regulation, and those principles include the idea that you target regulation on actual evidence of harm, that you think very carefully about unintended consequences, either for harming innovation or holding back freedom of expression. So you think very hard about those sorts of risks. And regulation also has to work in practice. It's got to be practically enforceable. So if you like, there are some very well-established principles. If I could give a couple of examples of, I think, when they've been applied well and when they haven't been. So one of my favourite interventions, regulatory interventions, goes back to 1968, when in the US, the Federal Communications Commission intervened in relation to, there was a dispute about whether ordinary consumers should be allowed to attach their choice of telephone to a telephone network. And historically, the incumbent telephone networks had always said they can't, and they argued that they had control of telephone devices to address all sorts of harms, up to including the risk that people would electrocute themselves through attaching inappropriate devices. So there's this quite apocalyptic description of things that might go wrong. What the FCC said in its decision in 68 was that there was a risk. That risk could be mitigated by setting standards for the way in which telephones attach to networks, and that process of setting standards was both important but also sufficient. You didn't need to go any further. So we ended up with this quite targeted intervention. And that's been really important. It's a result of that intervention that, for example, people in subsequent decades were able to attach third-party modems to telephone networks. Some really important innovation was unlocked by that intervention. Then I think you mentioned social media. I think what I find striking about the current debate about the Online Safety Act in the UK is that I don't think that piece of legislation really measures up against the principles I described. So the scope of the Act is incredibly broad. I think there was a High Court decision just yesterday on the question of whether Wikipedia falls within the scope of the Online Safety Act. And in principle it does. Ofcom may still decide to tread lightly. But the fact we're even having that discussion feels slightly ridiculous to me. That, we shouldn't be talking about whether Wikipedia should be regulated under the Online Safety Act. Then secondly, there's clearly a set of concerns around freedom of expression, particularly toxic debate about those concerns, actually. In fairness, the Online Safety Act does include explicit protections of freedom of expression. The problem is the Act is sufficiently complex that those platforms, especially if you're a platform that doesn't have an army of lawyers, you're probably going to take a risk-averse approach. So I think that's a problem. And then finally, there's the enforceability bit. I mean, there's an enormous amount of publicity about the use of VPNs to essentially avoid the provisions of the Online Safety Act. And that was always a bit predictable. So none of this says that we shouldn't have regulation of that kind. There clearly is an issue that needs to be addressed, but perhaps with a bit more caution than we have, in fact, proceeded with.
I'm kind of curious around those two examples. It feels like the first one you mentioned on the telephones is something that's quite technical, and therefore you get a very quick feedback loop whether or not you have a problem. Kind of easy to also understand where the problem's coming from, right? Someone attached a telephone, or yes or no, they electrocuted themselves. Social media is much more complex, partly because it's mental health implications, so it probably acts over a longer time, and I'm assuming also it's much harder to properly assess what contributions social media had compared to other aspects that were happening in that person's life. So how do you regulate something that is so much harder, where the feedback loop actually is so unclear, and where if you wait for too long and you actually see the harm might be quite widespread?
So a couple of things. Firstly, I think the other reason why online safety is difficult is because of the extent to which it's politicized. A lot of economic regulation is carried out by technocratic regulators. There's some political pressure, but you don't get the level of political polarization that we've seen when it comes to issues around online safety. And I would say that's probably the biggest problem, because that in turn makes it difficult to take a measured approach. Because what I would want to do, I think you start gently. When I was at the end of my time at Ofcom, we were starting to think about online safety. It was already clear that it may come our way. And the ideas I had then were I think you ease yourself gently into the new area. I think you can do a lot by imposing transparency obligations on platforms. Because they both shine a light on their behavior that matters to them if they've got a brand they want to protect. And it also allows you to learn. I think that if you don't have the political pressure, then you can start slowly. You can apply as transparency obligations, as I say. You can also identify those harms which really matter most, those harms where there's no countervailing risk to freedom of expression. There's no good reason for putting up an explanation of how to make a gun, for example, on the internet. There are things where there's no countervailing freedom of expression argument. So I think you start with transparency. I think you start with the use cases which are particularly compelling need to act, and you learn as you go. I mean, that's not a perfect answer, but I worry about the rush to judgment that we're seeing at the moment, where not only have we had the Online Safety Act, but what you see at the moment is debate about going even further.
I think it's also interesting around if we compare this back to the car example that we started with. I'm sure more people die because of car accidents than because of suicide caused by social media. But you have significantly fewer letters, I assume, being written to MPs around the fact that their child was killed in a car accident and therefore cars need to be prohibited or whatever, heavily regulated.
But there will be the first time an autonomous vehicle kills. I remember an interesting discussion about what safety standards you should apply to autonomous vehicles. And clearly you need to stretch. I think you would hope that we improve safety for the use of autonomous vehicles. But if you apply a perfect standard, which is frankly where the political pressure might be because of the first headline, then the technology will never get rolled out. So I think the headlines when something goes wrong can be particularly toxic.
I can imagine a regulation probably has two purposes, right? One is to save people, or to kind of keep them from harm. But the second one is probably giving them the impression of being safe so that they don't kind of worry about certain things. And I wonder whether kind of, especially in this space now with this new technology, that is just as important. And therefore, whether people end up using VPNs or not, the posture of the government standing up and saying, look, we really care about children online still matters? Or do you feel like this is really missing the point and it comes at the risk of sensible regulation that would actually create a benefit?
So no, I do think it's important the government sets out a vision for what we want. So absolutely. The articulating a vision where it's safe to go online, impossible to disagree with, and I think it's helpful. You've still got to manage expectations. If what you then do is follow that with regulation, which is basically abused, then that undermines the message. So I think the vision is important. But then what needs to come in behind that, in my view, is practical regulation rather than something which either doesn't work or has unintended consequences.
So do you feel that there's ways that are actually technologically feasible to regulate something that's so complex, where there's so many unintended consequences, such as the online safety bill? I think no one can disagree with the fact that, people under 18 probably shouldn't be watching porn. But any way of trying to make this technologically possible has massive privacy nightmares that I can imagine.
So I would still start with, I think there are some things that are easier. So revenge porn is a good example where I think you can come down incredibly hard. And I think you probably get the cooperation of the platforms because there are no circumstances where that type of content is acceptable. So I remember sneaking into my first X-rated movie when I was probably 16 or 17. It wasn't hardcore porn, but kids have always stretched the limits a bit. So I think there's a judgment call about what you really come down heavily on and where you simply try and shift attitudes. And I think that requires a more nuanced approach than we've got at the moment.
So I think, if I understand you right, you're saying in general, it's easy to make grand promises, but much harder to have the real nuanced conversation around what can be achieved.
And I think you can make so I think you can make promises if you really focus. My experience of regulation is that if you decide you're really going to solve a particular problem, you've got a decent chance, especially if it's a problem where there's no one's going to disagree. So if you can get industry on your side, I mean, one of the perennial things for me is that regulation doesn't take place in a vacuum. Regulation has to, at some level, go with the grain of the commercial companies you're regulating it, because otherwise you're probably doomed. But if you can identify areas where you focus and where you can broadly build an alliance of companies who might not have done it, but are willing to go along, I think you can make a difference, yes. So I don't have a counsel of despair. I don't think it can't be done, but you've got to tread cautiously.
And you mentioned the complexity of enforcement. You've held many senior roles at Ofcom, including being the CEO for a little bit of it as well. So, how do you enforce anything like this if you're looking at an overall budget of Ofcom that's probably a tiny proportion of the free cash flow that any of the big tech companies, for example, generate?
Well, Ofcom's now got a fair few people. It's brought in a lot of new people for online safety. You're right. There's also always an asymmetry of resources, but what helps is if you have the right legal powers, so you can gather information on what companies are actually up to, rather than having just simply to believe what they say in the public domain.
Yeah.
If you can set norms, I mean, a lot of regulation is about trying to set norms through case law rather than take on every single case. Actually, a good example is, I think, the way in which the traditional regulation of broadcasting emerged. If you go back to the way we used to regulate television and radio broadcasting, I think that norms there emerged over a number of years, largely through the broadcasts themselves recognizing what good practice was. And that then being codified by regulators. So, I think that's a large part of it, shifting what people believe is acceptable. What you can't get to is a situation where you're going after every single bit of dodgy content on the internet. Obviously, that's mad.
Yeah. It still feels like by now, the fines that have been levied on some of the big tech companies are mind-bogglingly large. They're just, the cost of doing business for them, and they just continue in the right way. It doesn't really feel like they've changed their direction. We can talk about one social media platform in particular, right, which has been doing some fairly egregious stuff around circumventing security on users' devices in order to continue to collect data about them.
Yeah.
And, they might pay a few billion and that's it.
So I agree with you. Fines can be useful, but as you say, they often just become a cost of doing business. I think the trick is whether you can turn it into something that affects their brands, the way in which their consumers see them. For most responsible companies, they care about the way they're perceived by their customers. And if you can use a combination of transparency and penalties to create an environment where companies won't always get it right, and they won't always have an incentive to behave the way we want them to. But broadly, what is most powerful for them is the relationship they have with their customers. So you certainly need to find a way of affecting that.
The UK plays in a global world where everyone has a slightly different approach to regulation. How do you feel the UK regulatory landscape compares to the very laissez-faire approach in the US, or kind of the quite interventionist approach that Europe is going through at the moment?
It's a good question. I think the truth is we're not that far away from an EU type of approach. My own experience, I spent, as you know, a fair bit of time working, representing the UK in the EU bodies. My experience there is we're certainly at the liberal end of debates that went on in Europe.
Yeah.
That was particularly striking, for example, when it came to the debate about net neutrality. We were definitely at the liberal end, but I think we're still essentially European in the way we think about regulation. And that's sort of illustrated by the Online Safety Act. I can't imagine the Online Safety Act coming out of the US. Certainly not right now. So I think we are closer to the EU. What I regret is that we haven't been able to build a sort of transatlantic alliance when it comes to content moderation, because there are differences between Europe and the US, but they're nothing like as big as the differences between, say, us and China. For the UK, I think we have to work with the EU. It's madness to believe that there's anything we can do without doing that. But then there's also something about building bridges to the US. And I think I'm optimistic about that because I think the UK is still well respected. We're a medium-sized country. We can't pretend that our economic power compares with either the EU or the US or China. But I think what we say on, if you like, a policy perspective is still listened to.
And do you feel that part of the reason why Europe is much more interventionist in these areas in particular is just because there's no big players here? And therefore, kind of the business impact is smaller for us than it would be for the US to do something similar to this?
I almost wonder if it's the other way around, actually. I hate to say this, but if I look at the history of telecommunications, again, top of my book, during the last century, during the period where the telegraph was invented, France and Germany both assumed that the state should have complete control of these technologies. In fact, it wasn't until about 1850 that both France and Germany even allowed private citizens to use the state telegraph networks. So, there was a very much a sort of command and control view across Europe, way back then. We were quite late to liberalise telecoms. It wasn't until 1999 that those state monopolies were finally dismantled in Europe, well after the US, and comes to that, well after the UK. I think we have a history of being more interventionist. I do worry that that's part of the reason why we haven't seen the same amount of innovation that we've seen in the US. I mean, I can't prove that, of course, because who knows? But I worry about the risk that regulation is holding back innovation. Of course, the recent Draghi report sort of highlights that as a risk as well.
And so if we take it back to AI, what regulatory framework would you want to have for Europe so that we do get some of that innovation, but it also keeps, I guess, your grandkids' data, for example, private and keeps them safe?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I find it interesting that the EU is already talking about pulling back slightly from their AI Act, which I think illustrates that was probably a step too far, too intrusive, requires risk assessments that are probably impossible to carry out, frankly. But that's at least positive. The fact that the EU is looking again at that act is, I think, a positive step. I think we at the moment seem to have a position in the UK that we won't regulate at all, and I don't think that's sustainable either. So I think there's something, I would say there are probably a couple of elements to it. One, I've already mentioned transparency. I think there's a lot that can be achieved by just providing greater transparency of what companies are doing. Because of the way that affects their brand. But I think the other key point for me about AI is the need to look use case by use case. What we need to think about is which are the applications of AI that creates the most actual risk. And obvious examples that I worry about are the effects of deepfakes on democratic debate, and at a slightly more technocratic level, what the use of autonomous vehicles means for the way in which we think about liability in the case of accidents. Those are, I think, good examples where AI transforms, if you like, a sectoral regulation. It can't stay the same as it was. And I think you start by trying to tackle those. In the UK, there was a very good report by the Law Commission a few years ago asking about how you might think about liability in a world of autonomous vehicles. That was a good piece of work precisely because it looked at a particular use case in a measured way. With deepfakes, I've seen some interesting work on the use of watermarks. We've got the technology to distinguish the origin of content. What's required, I think, is some sort of governance process which provides traceability. So, for example, that might allow the BBC, when it displays a video or an image, to guarantee that the source of that image is not AI. That's technically possible. And I think those are the sorts of things that I think we can address.
I think fake content is particularly interesting because there's definitely some views out there that even if we tell you it's fake, if it confirms a position you already hold, it's very unlikely to change your mind.
Yes.
So what is it here that you end up regulating? Or what is the impact that you can actually generate for regulation?
But that's always been the case. When I was running Ofcom's content team during the Brexit referendum, when there was the famous lie about the 350 million.
Yeah.
And I remember, I'm trying to work out, what should Ofcom as a regulator do about that? What we established is that whenever the lie was spoken, it was rebutted. If people wanted to make their own minds up about it, they could. The truth is they'd already made their minds up, and that is always a problem. So I don't think regulation cannot be a fact checker. Regulation cannot tell people what to think, ever. I think what it can do in the case of deep fakes is ensure that those people who want to understand the origin of a news report do at least have the tools to do it. And I think that's really important. That could be quite transformative, but it's not going to solve everything.
Content authenticity is one of those things that the industry is already looking at, right? There's this program, Adobe is working together with the BBC and Microsoft and a bunch of other organizations to try and actually validate that something has come from the lens to the screen. Do you feel there's also a regulatory angle here then as well?
I'm not sure, but actually it's precisely because industry is working at it that I'm hopeful, because I think that makes it possible to imagine a world where there are clearly some players who, for commercial or ethical reasons, want to fix this problem. If there was a residual problem, if we still have free riders who are not willing to go with whatever emerges from that process, then there's a role for regulation. But it's much better if regulation builds on I said this before, on established norms. It's much better for regulation to look at what responsible industry players are already doing and extends that further. What is usually a disaster if regulation tries to invent that for itself.
It feels you definitely prefer, let's call it outcome-based regulation, right? You focus on the use cases of the technology rather than the technology itself. One of the interesting discussion points at the moment around AI is the question around copyright and copyright
Yes.
infringement, and to what extent should you be allowed to train models on copyrighted material. And we've seen already that model builders are considering shifting to geographies where this is a little bit easier. Japan is like particularly lenient when it comes to using the copyright material from others. What's your view then here around like how do you deal with situations like these?
So, gosh, it's difficult. Firstly, I do worry about the risk of offshoring activities as a way of evading regulation. There's a long history of that. Actually, pirate radio stations are a classic example. You know, we tried to have a very prescriptive approach to broadcast radio in this country, and it just went offshore. The same happened in France. I think France, post Second World War, there was a rather restrictive regulation of radio within France. But all that happens is you've got the radio peripherique, which, you know, broadcasting into France from outside. So there's a long history of people evading regulation by offshoring. I think that is why, as a regulator, you can't be too far ahead of international norms. You have to recognise that otherwise people can just offshore. But I think you can still have a go at influencing as long as it's still possible to do these things in the UK on terms that are not too restrictive. Then I think people still want access to the UK market. They will still want to train data, say, on UK consumers. The Japanese market is not the same as the UK market. No two markets are alike. So I still think that there's a benefit to commercial players in understanding the UK market, using data from the UK market, as long as the terms on which they do so are not too much out of line with international norms.
And so, given that we're already a little bit behind, partly because we're being more regulated than maybe China or the US have been in the space of AI, there's been this floating idea of doubling down on open source to give you a bit more of an edge, and that would, I guess, also support your make it transparent perspective. Do you think that's like a reasonable approach to try and catch up?
My concern about open source, I'm not sure who pays for it. It's a bit like, I mean, you'll recall when we were on the Geospatial Commission talking about open data. With both data and software, it works if someone has an incentive to pay for it to be good, crudely. There's clearly room for open source, and there's some brilliant examples of successes with open source software. I'm up for stretching those examples as far as we can. I don't think Europe can rely on it. I think Europe has to get to a position where there are commercial incentives to create these new technologies and make commercial successes of them as well. Not sure open source does that, except with a lot of taxpayer funding, frankly.
I wanted to come back a little bit to your grandkids and coming back to this question around what regulation you want to see for them. Given how you've seen technology evolve across other episodes in the past, what do you think the world might look like when your grandkids leave their home in 15 to 20 years?
Gosh. Well, firstly, I have no idea. I remember a few years ago, Ofcom being asked to predict what will be happening in 10 years' time. And I think I resisted trying, and in the end I got it wrong. I mean, well, actually, no, be more precise. In 2015, we did a big strategic review of telecoms. And I introduced that big strategic review by going back to 2005, which had been the previous strategic review 10 years previously. And in 2005, we didn't have the iPhone, we didn't have Netflix, we didn't even have iPlayer. The whole series of things which by 2015 had become ubiquitous, that in 2005 simply didn't exist. And it's not that you couldn't see them coming. In 2005, you could certainly see the seeds of all those innovations, but I don't think you could possibly predict what would come of them. I think it's a bit the same now. I do, though, if I think about my grandkids, I almost step back from the specifics of the technology, because the reason I'm an optimist is because if I think about my grandparents, I feel I'm much better off than my grandparents, who essentially, on one side of my family, they were persecuted Jews who ended up in the UK, and the other side, they were basically peasant farmers in England. I'm much better off than them, and that's partially because of prosperity and the prosperity that innovation has brought, and that's why I feel so strongly that we should not do anything that harms innovation. But the other reason why we're better off is because broadly the international institutions that we've put in place since the Second World War, mostly we now resolve our differences peaceably. And it's incredibly painful. I used to hate the meeting in Brussels negotiating with the other 27 when we were one of the 28, but it's still a damn sight better than going to war. So I think that's the other thing. My grandparents lived in a world of a world war. My grandkids, I hope, will live in a world where we settle our differences peacefully. And that is just so transformative. So that's why I'm optimistic. Stepping back from the details of technology, that combination of peace and prosperity, peace and prosperity sounds like a rather, I don't know, trite thing to wish for your grandchildren. But, the history of Europe over God knows how many thousand years, it is quite the opposite of that. Yeah, that's what I hope for.
Do you have a view around how your children should be using technology with their children at the moment?
I have a hope. The art of being a grandparent is knowing the limits of being a grandparent. I think I'm lucky in that both my kids are broadly responsible. I think they both do have a reasonable understanding of technology, and they both care about the next generation. I suppose my role is perhaps to help them a bit, but it's probably at the margin. Actually, it's quite interesting. The debates when I was a kid were all about everyone watching too much TV and, how that was going to turn everyone into a brainless parasite. That debate, that's what you used to hear from the generation before me. I think we just have to be slightly careful about lecturing our kids.
Do you have any conversations? Do you have any conversations with your children around Dad, this whole technology stuff? You've been quite involved in it. At what age should I let our kids on social media? Or is that something that's not really discussed
I know
between
we've
you?
talked about it. We've certainly talked about it. And I think my kids are reasonably aware of the risks. I think generally there's a slight tendency to assume that kids don't understand what's happening to their data. And my experience is that a lot of kids do. A few years ago, I remember at Ofcom, we did a project looking at the way in which we had a set of recent graduates at Ofcom, and we ran a project which was only those recent graduates were allowed to take part. And it was all about what's your understanding of the way in which online platforms use your data. And I think that revealed is they had a pretty sophisticated view of the way in which data was used. They had different views as to what was acceptable to the older generation, but they did not understand it. That's not to say it's true of everyone, but I think I have to be careful not to lecture our kids. Obviously, there's something about that they do ask me questions and I try and explain things, but without telling them what they should do with their kids.
I wonder whether there's a parallel around being grandparents, like being a non-exec.
Yeah.
Being the parent is the executive, and therefore you have to find ways of guiding your children in the right way and influencing your children to have the impact on your grandchildren rather than directly deciding on the direction. Is that fair?
I think it's very fair, and I've found it difficult to adjust to both roles. I have to confess, being a non-exec, I think most people who have had an executive career and care about detail, I think the adjustment to being a non-exec is quite difficult. It's absolutely the same with your grandkids. You want to be more hands-on than you really should be. But you learn.
You've had quite an interesting career in general, right? You started as a physicist, then you worked in the telecoms industry for a long time. Then we talked about the work that you've done as a regulator, and now you're working as a non-exec and advisor. Do you feel that the stuff that has made you successful is something that will still be relevant for the generation of your grandkids? So can they learn something from that?
Yeah. And I think it is actually, because well, a couple of things. Well, firstly, I have a dreadful memory for facts. So I did okay in exams, but I had to work bloody hard at them. Dreadful memory for facts. I'm quite good at making connections between disparate types of facts. And actually what is quite reassuring is that, of course, is a mix of skills that is becoming more relevant in many ways. Remembering facts, still great to remember stuff. Of course, I don't understate that, but the ability to make connections is clearly key as we go forward. And I think the other set of skills that I always found fascinating was I think particularly when you're dealing with difficult policy questions, detail matters. I distrust politicians who don't bother understanding the detail, but you mustn't get lost in the detail. So there is something about understanding the detail but being able to see beyond it. Years ago, I did a course on history of science. I think some of the greatest scientists historically have been scientists who had a mastery of classical science, but also the ability to see beyond it. So I think it's that combination of true understanding of what we've got now, but the ability to not be captured by it.
You talked about it earlier. The regulation would be a little bit easier if the politics didn't get in the way. Politics, I guess, like to a certain extent, is maybe a different word for emotions. How important is it to be able to understand and manage emotions in yourself and others? Does that change, or has that always been the same importance?
I think it's got extremely importance with the current debate around social media and AI. I think it was always important. If I look back, the regulation I was involved in was always a mixture of technocratic regulation of telephones, as you described earlier, and content moderation applied to broadcasting. And people have always got much more emotive about what the BBC does than about what British Telecom does. Yeah, they might object when British Telecom doesn't fix their line, but you don't have the same amount of emotion attached to that as when the BBC broadcasts something people don't like. So I think there's always been more emotion when it comes to content creation, content distribution. And that is a problem in the online world, I think. I do think it makes good policy making hard. And I think you have to try and consciously step back slightly from a knee-jerk reaction to each new crisis. I think one of the arts of regulation is almost not making a decision too quickly, allowing yourself the time to reflect. Because like once you introduce regulation, it never goes. My experience of trying to get rid of regulation is it's almost impossible. So I think there is something about making sure that any new regulation is introduced cautiously. It's difficult though.
And why do you think that's the case, that regulation after it disappears? Is this the typical loss aversion that people have now gained from that regulation and therefore they're far more protective in keeping it?
Yeah, there's always someone who loses out if you get. There's always someone who can explain why something should be regulated. And they're probably right at some level. But once regulation is already in place, I can think of several examples where I've tried to get rid of regulation. There's often political pressure to deregulate. You see that with the current government and the last government. There's always political pressure to regulate less at an abstract level. But my experience is that whenever you identify a specific example of regulation that you might get rid of, yes, there's always someone who will lose out and their voices can be quite loud.
You've mentioned the difference between regulation of a utility, like a telephone company, and content creation, and in terms of what you had to do with the broadcasters. Where do you think AI will play in the long game? Is that going to be a utility, and therefore what we'll need to regulate is things like net neutrality?
Yeah.
Or do you feel it will be quite an emotive content creation perspective because it embodies some sort of values that represent somebody's views compared to someone else's?
It's a bit of both, isn't it? Because some applications of AI are clearly about economic regulation. Can you make an airplane more efficient through the algorithm that is used to fly it? That sort of economic/safety regulation, that's a fairly traditional approach. And generally we trust tech regulators to get those sorts of things right. You know, no one tries to understand how a jet engine works, but most people get on a jet plane to go on their summer holidays without even thinking about it. So that there's a whole sphere of regulation there where there isn't the emotion, but it's certainly complex. It's not the same, as you say, when it gets to content moderation, and that is what makes it hard because the emotion that's in play and the pressure that creates to do something, which in my view is not always the right thing. Sometimes it can be better to, I do feel quite strongly freedom of expression in particular is a really important value across all Western democracies. And we have to be very careful that the pressure to regulate doesn't undermine that.
And did you have a proxy metric or some sort of direct metric in mind that told you that you were probably getting it broadly right, especially when it comes to the more challenging bits to regulate?
We used to try, as I think all regulators do, we all try to assess the effectiveness of regulation. We all publish reports saying we've contributed X percent of GDP and so on and so on and so on. I think it's an important exercise. I'm a bit skeptical because almost invariably regulation is just one of the ingredients that affects innovation. If you look at where we got to now, that's a combination of brilliant technologists, entrepreneurs exploiting those ideas, and regulators doing the sensible thing broadly. I think you can absolutely see how far we've come over time. How you attribute that to regulation versus simply where we would have been anyway with innovation, I think is almost impossible. Actually, one of the nice things about being Ofcom is you're sort of, how can I put it? For most of the time, you're relatively lucky because you're dealing with a market which, if you did nothing, would get much better. Innovation, the broad course of human history is that innovation has made things massively better. In telecoms, I've got a nice statistic. I reckon the first telegraph network, which was introduced in the 1790s, has an effective bandwidth of about 10 or 20 bits per minute.
Wow.
That was enough for complex messages, but we now have bandwidths of a billion bits a second. So we've come an awful long way. And that's been driven by technological innovation and entrepreneurs exploiting that with regulating a bit of a supporting role. So you can certainly talk as a regulator about how much innovation has improved the economy and the benefits of the economy. I think it's a bit dodgy when regulators try to claim the credit for that.
And obviously, the world has changed a lot, as you just mentioned there, even throughout your career. I'm kind of really impressed always by how much you're able to stay on top of a lot of those details across so many different fields. What's been your secret here, and what do you think other grandparents or parents should do in order to make sure that they can make the right choices to support their families?
The thing that's always motivated me is just I find the technology fascinating. I find its exploitation fascinating. I feel I've just been very lucky. I started out doing astrophysics research as a student because I found that fascinating. The idea of the universe and the galaxy and the way the stars work, I found that fascinating. And I guess I've never really lost that fascination for the natural world, what makes it tick. I just feel incredibly lucky that throughout my career, that's what I've been able to look at, in different ways, different aspects of the natural world, but it's all been driven by a fascination with the art of the possible.
More of your recent jobs in particular are not just about the natural world, but also a lot about the human interactions that's slightly more complicated compared to the physics that underlie a lot of that technology. Has your interest therefore shifted to that side as well, or has that always been something that was just part of your job?
I think I started out when I was young, a long time ago. I was very much a technologist, quite introverted. As you grow older, you do realise it's that human interaction that conditions the way technology is used. I mentioned earlier at this point about the main thing that telecoms did was turn human society from local to global. And you could think of that as a technological problem, but really it's a point about culture. The fact that we're having this interview and we happen to be in the same country, but we don't have to be. The fact that much of my time at Ofcom, I represented the UK internationally, and you wouldn't think twice about having the same policy debate in the US, India, or in China. So I think that the internationalization that telecoms has made possible is absolutely about cultural relationships.
And do you think any of that stuff was predictable when the first telegraphs were starting to be built?
There were people who made predictions. I was quite struck. There's a pioneer called Francis Ronalds who, I think in 1816, created what may have been the first electric telegraph network. And it was quite a peculiar instrument because you didn't have batteries back then. It was all based on the use of static electricity, using Leyden jars to create a signal and then pith balls. So it was elaborate technically, and he tried to persuade the English Admiralty to adopt it and they refused. He wrote a book about this in 1823 where he talked about governments meeting across basically Parliament meeting in Brighton. There's this phrase, conversazioni offices around the country. It was this idea that communications could make possible this type of distant interaction, despite the fact that it was another 50, 100 years before it happened. So I think people do have this vague idea of what the art of the possible is. Actually, one of my favourite examples is the first chief technology officer of the BBC. He had a vision for what was possible with the cable. He started out designing the BBC's first radio network, but he then went on to work for Rediffusion, one of the first relay companies, first cable networks, if you like. Describes an interface which not that different from what Netflix looks like now.
So if the telegraph moved distance as a constraint on interaction, do you have a sense of what the thing is where AI might remove constraints?
Isn't it mainly the friction that comes from the repetitive work required to turn an idea into a product? So a positive view of AI is that human beings still have the ideas, they're still in control, but that AI can make the process of turning that into a product almost frictionless. That's, I suppose, the way I think about it, but that's almost certainly too simplistic.
It's a really interesting question, right? What's the constraint at the moment around progress? It definitely makes sense to me that if you needed to ride around with a horse to tell someone there's something needed to be doing, that there's a massive loss there. I'm less sure where we have intelligence constraints right now, that the reason we're not able to get progress faster is because we don't have enough brain power versus more complex human coordination concerns or constraints in that sense.
I do wonder if, I mean, I worry slightly, more than slightly actually, about the hype with AI, because there is a view of AI that it is simply an evolution of ideas on automation, which go back several decades. And automation has been incredibly powerful, of course, as a way of improving efficiency, productive efficiency, but it's also had countervailing risks. There's a lovely paper that goes back, I think, to the early 90s called The Ironies of Automation, which talks about what happens when you take humans completely out of the loop and simply expect them to provide a sort of quality control function. They essentially don't do it well. So I think there's a version of what's happening with AI, which is that it's a continuation of that process of automating boring jobs with all the benefits and risks that brings. Remembering that a lot of people do have jobs that are boring.
When you meet people for the first time and they realize what you've done for a living, is there any question that they ask you around technology that comes up regularly?
They usually ask me why their mobile coverage is crap. Almost invariably. So in the end, it comes back to lived experience. So it used to be that people would complain about their broadband connection. I would say for most people, that's now getting better. The broadband for a lot of people has got much better. And I think when it's fibre, it will be not much of a residual concern. A lot of people, when they discover I work in telecoms, their gripe is, why can't I get a mobile signal on my street? And I think it's important because, you know, to draw a parallel, I would say the telecoms industry, we slightly lost our way with 5G technology. We had lots of whizzy ideas about what 5G could do. And I think we slightly lost touch with what actual consumers care about, the lived experience, which, as I say, is, can I get a signal in my street? And I think that is the risk with any technology. You've got to, at some point, bring it back to how it affects real people's lives.
Thank you, Steve. This was a really fascinating conversation. Just one last one before you leave. If AI over the coming years allows you to spend more time with your grandchildren, how did this happen?
I'm hoping it will. And for me, there's one or two tasks that I find really painful at the moment, and I'd love AI to help with. Let me give you an example. So I'm doing a lot of research into the history of telecoms. A lot of source material is in languages other than English. The translators that you can get at the moment are better than nothing, but still not very good. What I personally would find brilliant would be a really effective AI-powered translator. And that feels like it's within reach, but we're not there yet. So I suppose that's what I'd ask all the technologists to go away and solve, so that I can read Chinese source material in a way that doesn't require me to learn Chinese.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Steve.
Thank you very much. It's good to talk.